Welcome back, Tribe. Today we're here with Mataw guru Marc Lawrence. We're going to be discussing Filipino martial arts, and I want to welcome Marc to the show. Marc,
hello, everybody. I'm doing well.
Great. Marc, so for the audience at home who may not have encountered you before in their training career, give us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got started in the martial arts, and especially your area of concentration, which is the Filipino martial arts.
Let's see. My martial arts journey has been a very long one. It started in childhood. I have trained in martial arts literally since I was a young child. I could go on and spend a lot of time in that. As far as with the Filipino martial arts, I got introduced to it originally before I met my wife through a co-worker at the refinery where I worked. He taught arnis de mano, Filipino stick fighting. And when I met my wife, my father-in-law knew a little bit. He showed me some because he felt that it was important that a husband should be able to protect their wife. And I asked him, I says, well, is there any more? He says, yeah, there is, but I don't know it. And that kind of started me on this journey of going from one person to the next. Next thing you know, I was being introduced to a townmate, which we called Manang Espi. And we went over and trained with him. He was a boarder with one of the cousins, an old man who had trained and fought and things, and old school. And he showed us some. And then I said, "Well, you know any more?" He says, "I don't know anymore, but go see your mother-in-law. There's somebody she needs you to meet." Anyway, well, that sent me over to one of the halls where a fellow had just come into the country and introduced me. This was my first bit of formal Filipino training, was with the Doce Pares with Erwin Mosqueda. And I met the people from the Doce Pares group, and from there trained with them and wandered from there to Felix Royles, who was a world heavyweight champion in stick fighting, and ended up training with him and getting my first recognition as a master under his association. And that was like, I want to say that was like my first recognition as under that system and all was like 15 years ago, roughly.
And you've continued to train in the Filipino martial arts, and I know that you're actively teaching the arts. And where do you teach?
I teach over here in Torrance, California. I teach a class in the park, which is a community class. I've been teaching that now. I started teaching that before. It's kind of funny. We started teaching that class before I started training with Felix. So it's been going on now. We figured out about 16 years in the park, and so it's one of the longest running free, basically low cost classes. We started out free, and then we turned around and found that people wouldn't value it, so we had to charge a little bit, and we still charge just a little bit. And that class is still going on every Monday night. And then I also teach for a Kung Fu school. I teach weapons. And I teach there in Torrance at the Scholar Warrior every Tuesday night.
Excellent, Marc. So let's go ahead and delve into our subject for today. And the Filipino martial arts are obviously a topic that would require much more than one podcast. But what I want to focus on specifically with you is just to get your views as one of the people that have been training for a very long time. You kind of come from an older generation, and you've trained with some of the older generation of instructors. Just want to get your opinion on how the Filipino martial arts in general, and again, that's a very big catch because there's, literally, dozens, probably hundreds of different systems with different influences. But in general, in your experience, I wanted to get your opinion on how things have changed from one generation to the next. Tell us a little bit about just historically, what the Filipino martial arts were like and how they've grown from there.
Well, okay, Filipino martial arts is a very, very interesting and very complex subject. You have to understand a bit of the history of the Philippines to understand how it is and why it is and to get to where it is today. When you understand that the when we call Filipino martial arts is a art that was heavily influenced by the Spanish, then by the Dutch, by the Portuguese, by the Chinese, everybody they had to fight, and particularly the Spanish. If you look at Filipino martial arts, most of the terms and commands are all done in Spanish. That is because the Spanish had to go ahead and protect their Christianized citizens from the southern invaders, the Moros. So because of that constant dealing with what they called the pirate wind, it required them to train up militias to protect their taxpayers and church members. That's why when you look at what is considered Arnix de Mano today, you'll hear all these commands, and you'll still see the core of it being cinco terros, the 5 classic strikes, which goes back to old Spanish sword fighting. So you start with that, understanding it was always a village art designed to be taught to a militia, both men and women, to protect their villages. And you started out with, basically you had your core system, and some of it was very simple, and each family would kind of develop their own, each village would develop their own, each region would end up developing their own based upon the type of weapons they had available to them, depending upon how much steel they had available, depending upon what was available. So classically, in the old days, the method of fighting started out in long range. And you would start off, it's funny, people always think of it starting off with just, just stick fighting, but classically it was not that. In the old days, it started with spears, with shields, and you throw spears. Why? Because the longer it is away, the further away you are, the safer it is to your family. Anytime there's a loss to the village, because everybody's intermarried and interrelated, it was a loss to a family, and that was a terrible thing. So you wanted to preserve your family. So it was designed to be a defensive village art. And then it developed from that, you had the ability then to make firearms. So again, it starts long range with spears and simple firearms. The Spanish talked extensively about the escapas, which were handheld cannons. They're very basically, you almost call them, almost like pipe guns, and that's kind of what we do today, where they were basically like pipe shotguns that worked very well, and they cast them out of brass. They also developed and had cannons that they put on their forts that fortified the villages called bantacas. And then basically there were 2 types. One fired projectile, the other one fired shot made up out of basically packages of rock. So they were little small rocks, just like a shotgun. Now in the tropics, any cut you have is a bad thing. So understanding that, they also had weapons in the south. In the south, the Dayak used blowguns. They called them the sumpit. In the north, the Negritos had little blowguns too. Again, they were using poison. You didn't want to get hit by those. That kind of morphed into later on something called the pana, which is still used as a street weapon today, which is basically they're taking nails, flattening them out, put them to a slingshot, and then firing them at you with feathers on them. So if you look at like what makes up classic, the old core, pre-war weapons, have free neighborhood. So what you'd have is you'd have the panas, so they'd fire arrows at you. If you came down chasing them, they actually had what they called bagakis. They were double-ended wooden spikes that they could throw at you in a handful like darts. And then if you got closer, they had fire-hardened, sharpened-end sticks. But most of the fights in the Philippines actually used to be fought. You talk to the old-timers, they'd be fought at a distance with projectile weapons, except down into the streets where then it was close quarters. And then they would fight in like a regimental style if needed, using shields and the bolos. So you see how things have slowly changed and things have been forgotten. And the Spanish really didn't like the idea of the populace being able to fight back. At first they did, and then as they grew in their influence, it became more of a problem till we get up to about 1896, where the Philippine War for Independence starts, and and you have not just the bolo brigades, but you have men that are running weapons and organized military units, and you have the Civil War that starts. and the Americans step into it, and the Spanish-American War in 1898, bringing us up to firearms being now widespread and the bolos being used. And that's where the bolo, the sword work, the short sword work with the agricultural blade, really becomes a legend, because it was used, you know, the Americans came in, especially into the South, and they picked up the fight that the Spanish had because they wanted to subjugate the people there rather than let them be free. It led them to fighting back, and after them rounding up weapons, well, what have they got left? Agricultural blades. And these guys would come in and just tear up, and that's what they found out. Americans found out that the 38 long Colt, which they were carrying at the time, was worthless. You put all 6 rounds, and the guy would still kill you with a bolo and go on to the next guy, and only the Craig would stop these guys that basically were high on a natural type of speed and on a religious quest. So that's where Filipino martial arts really suddenly becomes almost mythical and legendary in its ability to fight. Again, it was a village art designed to be taught very quickly, simply and effectively during the periods of the raids. Because then there'd be the raids happen. Understand, Filipino tradition used to be, we'd go raid the next guys, take their stuff, take some slaves, and there was 2 types of slaves. There were full slaves, and there were slaves that you could basically work their way out of. And they would go back and forth with their double-hull, basically you call them war canoes, very similar to the Tahitians, except they mounted guns on them. And they would raid each other back and forth, stealing slaves, going back and forth, and had wars. I mean, until the Spanish came in, really until like 1898, things were still pretty not fluid. I should say pretty fluid in some areas. And that's what made the need to fight and survive so important. One of the things that any village could do was train on the basics with sticks. Sticks was a basic weapon. It was actually called a bunal, a club, and you'd have fighting sticks that were made out of hardwood, and some of them even had, if you look at them, they call them a baston, and they have a hardened edge to them. They weren't just these rattan sticks that everybody plays with. Those were just for teaching you. So that's kind of how we have led into a more modern time, because First World War and then beginning of the Second World War, particularly the Second World War, you know, the Filipinos had their own army, the Commonwealth Army, and they fought with the United States, and they held out for 6 months against the Japanese imperial forces. And then after that, you know, we had many relatives in my family that basically were prisoners of war. They were then pardoned, and they were told to go be good citizens, and they promptly went back and joined the guerrilla units and went off to fight the Japanese using, you know, basically pipe shotguns, the panas, again, the little sling arrows, and the bolos, and doing ambushes routinely, and holding out and fighting off the Japanese, literally to the point where the Japanese controlled the cities, but they sure didn't like going into the country because you're going to get ambushed. So our niche becomes very much a fighting art, protecting a country and holding out until the Americans come back in, and then joining in with the American forces and then pushing the Japanese back out. That brings us to the post-war. You know, a lot of good arnisadors died in World War II fighting for their country. There's a lot of good men, you know, some quite legendary about the number of people they took down. A good example is Saavedra. You know, they say that 9 Japanese died with him at the fiesta they set up to ambush him. One of the old stories I heard from one of the people that lived, that was his neighbor. So imagine, this is the roots of Filipino martial arts that just, you know, not that many years ago, you know, was a fighting art for survival. And that's how we get into the 1950s, and where Filipino martial arts now starts getting a little more sporterized, but it's still being used, and we have the post-war bad economies, and there was a split in Filipino martial arts, I should say, in the Filipino mindset. One was, if you had money, especially into the 1960s, there was what they called the poor man's art. Arnis de mano, eskrima, or talis, it wasn't actually called tali, that's an American adaptation, was designed to be a simple fighting art that was used basically by people down near the waterfront and back into the mountains and in the poor neighborhoods. If you had money, you took karate. Later it became taekwondo. You took Chinese martial arts because that was a rough man's art. So that's kind of how the roots of Filipino martial arts gets where it is today, and why it actually has some of these things that happen in it still today.
Now, Marc,
does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Now, Marc, let me ask you this. Is it at around this time that the arts start? Because I understand that the arts for a long time were an oral tradition. Is this when things start to become very systematized, when curriculums start getting put down to paper, where there is not a need to use it anymore for warfare? I would imagine that is when some of there's time and motivation to start doing some of those things.
The earliest book I found was actually from, I want to say there's an old book that was out in the 50s, and that was like the first documentation, and it was all based on Blade, and what this fellow was showing was basically what he knew of the art. So here we go, this is the first bit of documentation. It's still oral tradition. It's still, okay, we're going to go out and practice this, we're going to do this, and we're going to work at it. And we didn't see a belt system come in. The whole belt system and more formalization, really, if you look at when it started, Dos País started with their multi-system. You had the split off with Takoy and his family, starting with his system in the 1970s. And then we have Remy Prisas coming in with his. And again, it was a multi-system. And now you're starting to see in the 70s things getting written down. And that's where it starts. And that's where you start seeing the formal schools versus the clubs. And the clubs were basically like neighborhood defense forces. So you can imagine, this is not your kinder, gentler. It's a rough element. And so in the 70s, they still had people who trained that they were protecting their neighborhoods, but you start seeing more formal, and Remy Prisas looks around seeing what the Japanese are doing and their success, and especially with karate, and he takes it and starts peddling it in that manner, and it gets more accepted. He was very good at getting the public, especially in the Philippines and then outside of it, to see the amazing manner of Filipino martial arts. But he knew more than one style. It used to be everybody had their own style. So imagine there's hundreds of styles in different areas and different places all over, and everybody will tell you their system was the best. And you had people who said, okay, well, you're a largo mano, you're all longhand. Well, okay, you're all corto, you're sabrada, and each one of these was its own. It wasn't all blended together. So one guy would say, well, I specialize in this. Another guy would say, okay, well, I just do tappy-tappy. All I do is empty hands. Another guy, I'm a dumag. I'm just all in wrestling. And so it wasn't like it is today where you have this layered system that does all of this stuff. Each person and in each area had different things they did. You look at like boxing, like Panatukan, the dirty boxing, and Filipino boxing. That really took off in the 20s, and boxing was still something taught in the poor neighborhoods, 20s, 30s, 40s, especially after World War II, when the Americans coming back and boxing was big, and it continued being big. It was actually really big in the 20s and 30s with the Filipinos who came over to the U.S., and there were some amazing boxers, and they took their footwork originally from Blade and their methods of boxing and blended it with the Americans, making some amazing lightweight boxers.
Now, Marc, historically and in the early days of the documentation of the art, you mentioned that Blade seems to be the focus. Nowadays, if you mention Kali or Screama, the first thing that pops into somebody's head is sticks. Where was the transition from Blade to stick, and was it a transition that was done consciously to kind of appeal to a peacetime audience? When you mentioned, you and I both teach Blade, and Anytime you mention blade work, you get looked at like you got three heads. I mean, was this something that they were conscious of and trying to kind of change the image of the art, or was it something that just kind of evolved for a different reason?
Well, okay. You take the 1960s, okay, let's start putting the blades away. The agricultural people, you'd carry a stick, you'd keep the dogs away, you'd use it. You could carry on the jeepney. But see, even today, you get in rural areas, everybody carries a blade. It's no big deal. So, but the change was in the 70s. This change was in the 70s was Remy Presas sold the idea of Arnis, and I still have the old books, of Arnis being used for physical fitness. Now, we don't want a bunch of people at a school working with blades, especially a bunch of middle school kids. So he came up with the idea of using sticks for PE, and he wrote books on it, and he published them, and he even came up with rules for tournaments, and he worked with others, and he went around selling the idea. And then he moved into the 80s and doing this, and I mean, it was really, he did this for many years. It was very successful, and what it did, though, is it changed the art from being blade in many systems to being stick. You know, he had a huge impact. I don't think people really give him the full credit for his impact to the art and bringing it and making it more popular. He also developed the idea of, rather than you have to go to one school, he came up with this idea of doing seminars. So you could go around the country peddling it. And he started peddling it so you could go from place to place and people would take it in small pieces.
Now, Marc, discussing blade versus stick, this is a subject that I hear a lot of debate about. And a lot of times you'll hear instructors say, well, yes, we train with the stick, but it's really a blade art. Other instructors, will say, no, it's a stick. We're training stick. And I wonder how much of the community is always really understanding the differences between blade and stick as far as application. There is a big difference when you're, yes, a stick can be a training tool, but, for example, the Japanese Kijitsu practitioners that use bokken, their wooden weapon looks like a sword. The rattan sticks don't look like swords. What are your thoughts on this as far as, the interchangeability of stick and blade and what instructors need to understand if they're purportedly teaching a blade system?
Well, okay. Now we're going to jump into something pretty deep, pretty quick. People who say they use sticks but are teaching blade. And there are people who say that they're just teaching stick. Remember, the stick is an impact weapon. Okay? That is what it is. Now, the mechanics of swinging a short sword are the same as a heavy stick to a point. But that's where it stops. Now, being honest and truthful about that, that's where you say, okay, all right, so now what changes drastically? Well, let's see, blocks, parries, locations of your hands, how you actually apply the blade. I always say to people, I say, okay, if you're good, I have a little test for you. And, I have a bunch of machetes that I've bought that I've ground, and they're ground nice and round, like basically it's nice and smooth. I've taken them to a belt sander so they're polished. And so the edges are all rounded and polished, and they look like big butter knives. And I'll say, okay, now, can you apply this and show me how you would solve this? Now this is a blade, and by the way, you have no hand guard. So it changes it drastically on what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. You look at a good example. People who are really really spend time in stick art know a lot of different disarms. Why? Because there's all these cool disarms you can do if somebody's coming at you and using a stick. But you can't do those with a blade, because if you wrap your hands around that way, you pick your fingers up for breakfast sausages, on a good sharp blade. It just doesn't work that way. There are things that just don't work, with a stick nor a blade. I mean, the mechanics of cutting, Are you really are you hammering with this thing, or are you slicing with this thing, or are you chopping with this thing? Are you poking, or are you thrusting? It's huge, you know. You see a lot of arts that say, well, I teach blade, and okay, show me your parries. You know, can you use all the surfaces of a blade? Do you know how to use the surfaces of your blade for parrying? What can you preserve your edge because you don't want to snap your blade off? You know, European swords are heavy enough and allow you to do edge-to-edge blocking, and it can do winding and binding. Filipino swords do not allow you to do that because the Filipino agriculturals are too short and have no handguards. You'd lose your fingers doing that. So, you know, when the old meter goes off and you say, okay, so show me the difference. I always love what Bram Frank once wrote about this, and I got to give him props because he teaches bolo, and he's one of these guys brutally honest about it. And he said, well, look at the demonstration, and afterwards you look at what is left of the blades and how they were blocking, and they literally beat the edges off of them. And these are supposed masters, you know, to quote him, and they destroyed the blades. Would you do that with a live steel? No, you would not. You know, there are now Filipino masters who are starting to go towards and train with HEMA to go back to the roots to find out, hey, what is the rest of this story? And I give them props. There's not many because it requires them to get out of their neighborhood, humble themselves, throw on the white belt again, and learn the basics of sword, like they say they know, and that's a different animal, you know. It's very different because you have to respect the blade. Would you jump in for all I can take that? Well, you don't do that with an edge weapon. You'd be missing a limb. You'd be missing your head for some of the things I see people do. Does that kind of clarify the point and answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a very important point to clarify because there's a, you know, whether it be, you know, ill-intentioned or not, there is some deception as far as, you know, the actual skill set that you're training. And I agree with you. I've seen it myself where I've had friends that, you know, work these disarms and work based on the weapon being a blunt instrument. And, yeah, you have a rude awakening when you realize, hey, you can't do that with a machete.
It just doesn't work. I mean, sometimes it baffles me. And, you know, I've done where I take my machete, I'll bring a whole box of them out, dump them on the ground and say, okay, guys, we're going to do blade today. How many of you train in blade? Oh, we all train in blade. Okay, fine. Show me a tip parry. How do you use the edge? How do you use the false edge or the back of your blade? And they get these blank looks, except for people who cross over into HEMA. And they understand exactly what I'm talking about, you know. And they're like, okay. And then I'll show them different tricks. And yeah, that's where your footwork gets really important because guess what? Any contact with steel is a bad contact. And I wish I wrote that, but that actually came from Bram Frank. He wrote it in an article, and I got to give him props because I was like, hey, why ain't that the truth? Anybody I've ever seen make contact with steel in my many years as a fire captain and a paramedic, it never ends well. It's like you end up with lots of big cuts, muscles and skin cut, and blood all over the place. So it's like you need to respect that.
Now, Mark, before we move on, I just want to clarify for the audience, you referenced HEMA a few times, and just for the audience's sake, if you're not familiar with the term, HEMA is the historical European martial arts, of which there is a large resurgence now.
That is correct. HEMA has done extensive work in the resurgence of historical European martial arts, and because Filipino martial arts has a heavy root in Spanish European martial arts, you know, it really takes people the time to go back and look at what makes up sword, you know, because it's great to say, oh, I train and well, fine. Okay, well, why would you stand there? Would you really do that? This is a blade. And if you really want to have some entertainment, and I say this to anybody, you guys, you know, blunt the edges, make them good and round, so big butter knives, so nobody's actually going to get hurt. You know, would you really try that? And then what would be left of you? You know, when you realize these are agricultural blades, and as the old timers used to say, they used to tell me that, it would be over within, no more than 3 moves. And it makes sense when you think about this, because when you look at sword fights, they're not extended. You're charging into battle. You're making contact. One of my relatives told me a story, and it was a World War II story, and it was pretty brutal. Basically, what they did is they used to have about 5 of them, and they would do these jungle ambushes on trails, and they would literally, the first guy all his job was to do was to get a single cut into a line of soldiers. So you'd have a unit walking along, they'd pop out of the jungle, hit a bunch of them, a couple guys would just run through, just hacking, and then the next guy would with another line, and the third guy would be coming to finish him, and the fourth guy would be killing him on the ground. And they'd literally do it with basically, it'd be like 2, and 1 would come and finish, and it was just this, you imagine these guys literally pop out of the jungle with razor sharp blades, and they're just quick cuts. Okay, you get your rifle, fine. Well, if I hit your hands, aka defang the snake, but I'm doing this with a bolo that can cut through, an 8-inch banana plant in one swing, or the neck of a pig, like we're serving lechon, in the same manner. You don't want to get hit by it. So any contact they're making as they're running, they're effectively disabling people in blinks of eyes. And so when you think about that, and these guys are coming through in an organized manner like that, and then the last guys are finishing them off. Well, that's the old village fighting methods that were used even by the headhunters. That's why they had the little axes that they would follow up with that were slightly bent, because they wanted to basically finish you off while you were on the ground. And that was the concept. So that's why you hear the old timers, this was done in 3 moves. Why you only needed 3 moves. They used to hear the 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, forehand, backhand, right? What more do I need? I can do that to anybody. Some were as simple as up and down and up. Some were just like Cristo, that make the sign of the cross. But with a blade, that contact, using surprise as the element, throwing fear, doubt, and confusion into the fight, it was effective on a jungle trail, not something you want to get hit or down a tunnel or an alley.
Now, Marc, let me ask you, because that segues pretty well into my next question. And I know that you do demonstrations, that you participate in competition, but I know from speaking with you and after we've kind of developed a dialogue that you are a fighter at heart, and your focus is practical application. With Filipino martial arts, and again, it's a little bit unfair to say Filipino martial arts because there's hundreds of styles and systems, but in general, I find them, fascinating to watch. I think that they're beautiful. The flow and the grace of a lot of the practitioners is amazing. But a lot of what I see, from my humble opinion, is either, at worst cinematic and at best recreational. What are your thoughts on kind of the current state of what's being taught out there, specifically from, the need for practical self-defense application?
Well, what I've seen is it seems to be a lot of schools have boiled into drills, click and sticks. It's like, okay, cool. So you can play with sticks and we can, and that's nice. But, when it comes to fighting schools, and, there's people out there that know me across this country. I've fought literally across this country at all kinds of tournaments over the years. I retired as a heavy competitor, and when I turned 50, I'm 54 now, I still do self-defense. I still fight in local tournaments and tournaments around the state that are open tournaments to all systems with all kinds of weapons, because I still believe in keeping it real and practical. There's nothing like fighting in a Masters division against other Masters if you think you've got something under the hood, kind of street racing, because that's the way it used to be. And it's funny because today you don't see guys be willing to say, come out to a open tournament where it's, okay, you can have HEMA guys, you can have guys who are trained in Chinese arts, you got guys who are trained in Filipino arts, Japanese art, and it's all like, okay, you step onto the mat and you got this lightly padded weapon, you got your helmet, you get your gloves, and you wear your cup because that's the rules, and it's on. They can kick, they can punch, they can throw, they can whack you with a weapon, and you can get knocked down. And I've seen very good masters get knocked down, just about knocked out in some of these matches, and it's like, now that's where you're testing your skill. To me, that's what the art was supposed to be about, not PE. If you want to do PE, it's funny, I joke about this because they actually trained and certified by the University of Cavite as a instructor, and I have the manuals and everything, and I have taught the class as a physical fitness class, just like they teach it, and that's part of it, and that's fine. If you want to click the sticks and use it that way, there's a great book by Professor Satico on these in 12 easy lessons. It's a great PE in college and high school fitness. It's great for coordination and teaching you how to move your feet and hands. But now we've lost what its purpose is, which is to teach you how to fight.
Mark, let me ask you another question, and this is just purely opinion here. But nowadays, there was a time when if you did one system of martial arts, that's what you did. And we are kind of losing our specialists, I think, in this era. Now, you may understand empty hand and you see the value in stick training or knife training, and so you pick up a little bit of Filipino martial arts, you try to incorporate it into your system, and that's something that's very, very common. I applaud it on one side because, I'm always going to applaud somebody that's willing to try something new and to try to seek out a better way of teaching and a more holistic way of teaching. But one of the things that concerns me is that I've seen, beginning to intermediate students from my friends' schools that are, traditional weapons-based schools, and they look like their understanding of the material far surpasses some of these instructors that are borrowing from other schools. What are your thoughts on that? Are people that are trying to incorporate Filipino martial arts, are they really understanding it? Are they really getting enough of an education in the art and how to properly apply it?
I don't think so. I think that there's a lot of people out there today, and this has been a problem for a long time, where they're trying to incorporate Filipino martial arts, and particularly the methods that come from blade, and particularly sword, and they're trying to basically, say, okay, I'm going to lump this in with my stuff. I don't even understand the footwork. I don't understand the use of the live hand. I don't understand the concept of evasion. I don't understand how to use a sword, but I'm going to teach you these drills. And it's like you don't even have the basics that make it up. What you have is you have some of the drills, and it's kind of like, sometimes I watch it, and I'm trying not to say anything mean, because it's better not to argue with people sometimes because they don't understand what they don't know. And then you see people who have really worked on understanding what this is and know how to do it and use it and have really incorporated it, but that's few and far between. Eskrima, there was the idea that, Eskrima, Arnis, or Kali could be added to your school, and it can be done if done correctly. But if not done correctly, we're just doing exercises with sticks. And we might as well be just going to a kickboxing class for fitness at that point, In answering the question about, telling the story particularly about my friend who teaches tempo, he had learned his eskrima from a fellow who taught tempo. So tempo was taught in a series of drills, where you do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and so they're not taught the concept, they're just taught, here's the technique, do it. So all of his eskrima was just like this tempo, and then I pointed out, I'm like, why would you lead with your weapon being behind you? Why would you stick your hand out in front? I said, we're not fighting empty hands. You don't have a shield. You're not a Greek hoplite with a shield. If you lead with an empty hand, it's a thing to get cut. I said, and I spent quite a bit of time helping him fix it. And at first he was kind of like, well, I'm a Kempo master. I said, fine, here's a padded stick, put on a helmet, here's some gloves so I don't feel too bad. Your job is to get me, and I'll stand here. I'll even stay in a little box. And your job is not to get hit in the process. And I have these thinly padded sticks, master to master. Let's have a little fun. And after he got a good bruising, I said, now will you fix and listen to me? And then he became my student, because it was like, okay, if I can stand in a 3-foot square, 3x3 box and not get hit and proceed to beat the snot out of a guy who's completely immobile, well, if you keep sticking your hand out in front first and then trailing with your weapon, don't block with unarmed parts of your body. It's not going to end well, It's funny because the Action Flex sticks made that are out there right now that you can get with a thin padding, they keep you real honest, and I think in some ways they're crueler than the rattan because they do have padding, but when you get hit by them, they'll leave bruises on you. They keep you honest, but that's also good for training people who have harder heads,
Now, Marc, staying on the topic of competition, one of the things that some of my friends participate in is, close to full contact stick fighting. And, the Dog Brothers are famous for pioneering that type of training here in the States. The concern I have with some of that, and give me your thoughts on it, I've seen a couple matches, and somebody will get hit in the head like 6 and 7 times, and then the opponent shoots a double leg takedown, takes him down, taps him out, and they win the fight. And I just kind of sat there saying, like, wait a minute, what happened to the 7 unanswered headshots this guy just took? It concerned me because I believe that sparring I've never liked sparring as a match as far as a competition. I think competition is competition, and sparring is something that's a teaching tool. And so I was kind of questioning, what is the lesson that's being taught to the student here? Okay, I can eat 7 shots to the head, but if I shoot the double leg, I'll be okay. What do you think about that? I mean, there are some pitfalls to training with equipment, padded equipment, and I want to know your thoughts on what those could be.
Well, okay, let's back up. All right, we're going to go back into the 1920s to Hawaii. Hawaii was the first place to hold stick fighting matches, and they used no gear. It was double stick. And I can tell you right now, in those days, they finally ended it because people actually died from their injuries, particularly from concussions. It was considered too brutal of a method of fighting. And, there used to be, back before the Dog Brothers got going, there used to be a tournament called the Best of the Best. And this is where guys would get together, and basically they'd wear helmets and hockey gloves, and everything went. And I can tell you right now, and they were wearing fencing masks and kendo helmets. You didn't want a shot from an actual stick to the side of your head. You'd get your head split open, and that would end the match. There was a match many, many years ago. There was a tournament that used to be held down in San Diego, and there was some pretty brutal fights. This is long before Dog Brothers got organized. Dog Brothers kind of made it more popular, and they've gotten safer because there used to be where they would fight with the rattan sticks. And props to them, they would fight with basically almost no gear because they looked at the WECAF and saw basically people armored up and just beating on each other with sticks, and they weren't respecting what the art was either. So it became kind of I'm going to go this way, we're going to go that way, and it's like, okay, you got to respect the weapon first. So that's why I've always kind of like saying, okay, well, what if we went to using, a lightly padded stick, and you've got your eye protection, you've got your cup, and you got your hands so your fingers don't get broken. But by the way, you don't want to get hit with that because it'll give you a headache. It'll knock you out. And now now you're getting it more like boxing, where you better respect, because you get clipped in the head, it'll drop you, But then, again, that becomes so brutal that a lot of people don't want to do it. And so the problem is people get further and further away from respecting the weapon. They'll do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. I mean, if you throw somebody into all that gear, they're going to come wailing in there on the stick, wrap around, and take, and it becomes basically just a slugfest of bad martial arts. And so then people go, how do you even know they're winning? How do you know they're losing? You can't. So some people, that's why they prefer the point method. in some of the arts and some of the, some of the systems, they used to do it with basically a single point, and if both of you hit each other on the head, you were both done. There was no winner. Now, you don't see that anymore. The best I used to see, and this is an old method, there used to be a stick game they used to play. And this would be done in the villages, and you don't hear this anymore, and this used to get done out in Hawaii, where they basically throw some white shirts on the guys, coat the sticks with something sticky, cover it with charcoal, and that way you could count all the marks. And the only rule was you couldn't hit them in the face to take their eyes out or bust them in the teeth. Everything else was fair. And they would use, they'd use cane. And you even whip with a piece of sugar cane. You go, oh, crap, that hurts. The other thing was they used to use this hollow river cane. And they'd play with that. Mom and Effie used to talk about that, and they'd break it. They'd go down till it was about a foot tall. You didn't want to get hit by it. It'd leave welts. And anyway, the old way, they'd count up all the marks. Who had the most marks? Well, that was the guy who lost. Well, people don't want to play that hard, so to get more people interested, it's been more and more sporterized. And then people said, let's add grappling, because grappling's cool. Grappling is popular. So grappling, it's like, let's go for double leg kickdown. Now, would you really go ahead, if they were using live sticks, slow your weapon down and try and rush a guy and he's got a weapon? No, he'd just skewer you with it. Or if he's using it as a club, he's going to do something really bad and break something. So you're not going to go ahead and do that. Again, it's something that's, boiled out of the sport where you're starting to lose touch with the reality of, fighting with real weapons. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Sir, let me ask you this. As you know, the tribe is dedicated to teaching warriorship as a lifestyle. And often that means we have to remove ourselves from the punching and kicking aspects of training and look at things that are a little bit deeper, looking at the mental and the spiritual aspects. Every major warrior culture has had some type of code, some type of way of developing the spirit. Tell me about the Filipino martial arts. What exists within the arts that helps the practitioners not only to become better fighters, but to become better individuals?
It depends upon the teacher. It really depends upon the teacher. Some teachers are very spiritual people and very much about principles. Others are sheer pirates and really don't have, other than you're loyal to me and you're loyal to the gang. Filipino martial arts runs the gamut from, literally people who are very spiritual. I used to love hearing stories about Kakwe. He was a very spiritual man. Many of the old masters that I've met over the years were very spiritual and very family-oriented. A lot of them had their own codes, and their codes were simple. They protected the young. They protected the old. They would step in the way of things, to make sure that the family would get away. They would think nothing of sacrificing themselves to save their family. They had a code very similar, I want to say, to the old Cossacks, of protecting the family, looking after their family, even if the person fell in battle. That way there was no thought of it. They were very much spiritual people, and they were also people outside of fighting that developed themselves elsewhere. Many of the old masters that I've known over the years were excellent dancers. Some were amazing musicians. They all had codes they operated by that made them who they were. And I've met some that were pure pirates. Literally, they were the neighborhood enforcers and debt collectors. And if you wanted to hold the chicken fights, you had to go pay manang because that was the way things were done, And it was literally, like out of the 1970s where schools would raid each other and fight it out, basically because they were rival gangs, So Filipino martial arts can run from, I've got a real code to, I have no code at all, literally other than a pirate code. So you really got to look at the teacher and say, how does he live and how does he treat his family and how does he treat his family members, not just his immediately family, but elsewhere. So again, it gets down to the individual. It's not like Shaolin where they have a whole code in which they operate by. It's literally from man to man, neighborhood to neighborhood, village to village, and system to system.
Well, that's a fair answer. Now, Marc, before we wrap up here, I want to make the audience aware of the fact that you have produced a good amount of training material that's available for sale. I always want to point people in the right direction to good teachers with good, solid material. Tell us what materials you have available and where people can find it.
Well, on EM3 Productions, I have 6 videos available. I have knife self-defense. I have uses of the live hand. I have training tips for tournaments. I have a whole variety of different videos. Like I said, I've got 6 different videos available there through EM3 Productions. You can also get them through I&I Sporting Goods. I&I Martial Arts Supply out of Carson, California. They have everything available there of all 6 of my videos. And then also I have books, and you can get those through I&I. Right now I have the Basics of Filipino Martial Arts available as a book available on sale there. I have Largo Alisi, the long stick methods. It is a composite system that I developed based upon all my experiences of using the long stick, and I have that available. I also now have a book available on Native American fighting arts based upon my experiences and training in the Native American arts available, and there'll be another book coming out here shortly, probably this month if everything gets done with my editor, on combat machete. And that's a class that I actually teach with the SoCal Sword Fights, an international event that's usually held here in Southern California through the HEMA organization.
Excellent.
And I have one more book that'll be coming out probably September on Filipino knife fighting and knife self-defense methods.
Wonderful, Marc. And for the audience also, if you want to get some of Marc's books, they're also available at martialbooks.com, which is the official bookstore of the tribe. So if you want to support Marc and the tribe, by all means, please visit us there. Now, Marc, if people are in your local area or if they want to get you out to a seminar or workshop at their school, what's the best way to reach you? What's your website and contact information?
Well, you can reach me through my website. I've got all my contact information there. My website is www.southbayfmaclub.com, or you can actually just email me directly on a personal email. It's mjlawrence@spcglobal.net. I am available. I do come out. I've done workshops all over the U.S. over the years, and I'm actually looking to do some workshops next year overseas and get out and share. You know, I just came back from Saturday doing a workshop on saber. I was very surprised at the number of people who showed up for it. Very large showing for and an interest in it. I didn't think I was going to have that many people, and had a very long day and a lot of fun. You know, that's the best part. And so, yeah, I'm available if anybody's interested, or if you get questions. I do answer questions, training tips. I'll be glad to answer any training tips, suggestions. I also have a YouTube channel. You can look at me under Guru Marc, and I spell my name with M-A-R-C. You can look at my videos there. And last but not least, I'm one of the few teachers that also goes into teaching cutting. So if you're interested in learning how to actually cut things properly, I put out videos on that and I'm glad to share. Many people say they teach blade, and I always like to say, then fine, let's do a cutting test. Anyway, it's just my little prop for cutting and cutting test, because it's a skill of a swordsman to see how well can you cut things and how good of a job can you do.
Excellent. And Marc, there is also a dedicated playlist on the Raven Tribe YouTube channel that also has a ton of your videos there, so people can definitely check it out on our YouTube channel as well. Just look for Marc's playlist. It's a ton of stuff on the Combat Machete Workshop, I believe, that you did, and upload it to YouTube. It's really great stuff. So, Marc, we hope to have you back on the show. There's so much more that we can talk about as far as your martial arts background and your experiences, and we hope to get you on for a couple more shows here in the near future. I want to thank you again for your time, making time in your schedule for us, and thank you again so much.
Well, thank you again for having me on the show. Looking forward to being back on the show. And, if folks out there got questions, have them, email into the show, and I'll do my best to answer them, and we'll include them in the next podcast.
Great. We'll be signing off for now. Thanks again, Marc.